quiet librarian, a mafia boss who never loses, and a marriage built on a lie so deep it could destroy them both, or save everything they never knew they needed. If this story pulls you in from the first breath, stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Scarlett Whitmore had $23 in her checking account, a dying succulent on her windowsill, and exactly no reason to believe that a Tuesday night in October would be the last ordinary night of her life. She was wrong. The knock came at 9:47 p.m. Not a polite knock. Not the kind a neighbor makes when they've locked themselves out or the delivery driver leaves before you can get to the door. This was 3 hard strikes. Deliberate, unhurried, the kind of knock that already knew you were home and didn't particularly care whether you wanted company. Scarlett was sitting cross-legged on her couch, with a bowl of reheated soup going cold in her lap and a paperback cracked open on her knee. The apartment was small, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building in Wicker Park that smelled faintly of old carpet and whatever her downstairs neighbor cooked on weekends. She'd lived here 4 years. She knew every sound the building made, the pipes in the walls, the elevator that groaned on the way up and shrieked on the way down. The couple in 4C who argued every Thursday like clockwork. She did not recognize this knock. She set the soup on the coffee table and didn't move for a moment, just listened. The hallway outside was quiet. No voices, no footsteps retreating. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. 3 men in the hallway. Tailored suits, all of them. Charcoal and black and navy, the kind of clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. One was tall with a jaw like a slab of concrete and hands that hung loose at his sides in a way that made her stomach tighten. The second was shorter, olive-skinned, watching the elevator with the practiced stillness of someone who'd spent years watching exits. The third stood directly in front of her door, close enough that she could see the faint gray at his temples, the flat professional patience in his expression. None of them looked like they were lost. "Miss Whitmore," the one at the door said. His voice came through the wood clean and even. "Open the door. We're not here to hurt you. We're here to deliver a message." Her heart was doing something ugly in her chest. She pressed her palm flat against the door like that would help anything. "I don't know who you are," she said. "No," the man agreed. "You don't. Open the door anyway." She should have called the police. She understood that clearly, with the rational part of her brain that was still functioning somewhere beneath the cold spreading through her ribcage. She should have stepped away from the door, picked up her phone, dialed 911, and kept her voice low. That was the smart thing. That was the obvious thing. She opened the door. Later, she wouldn't be able to fully explain why. Maybe it was the way the man's voice carried no heat, no threat, no particular urgency. Just the steady certainty of someone who already knew how the next 10 minutes were going to go. Maybe it was the suits. People didn't wear suits like that to do something messy. Or maybe it was simpler than either of those things. She was 28 years old, she'd spent the last 3 years being careful and quiet and invisible. And some part of her had been waiting for the world to come find her anyway. The man at the front stepped into her apartment without being invited. The other 2 stayed in the hall. He was maybe 50, with close-cut silver hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something harder and more permanent. He looked around her apartment with a brief, disinterested survey. The bookshelves crammed double-stacked, the soup on the coffee table, the dead succulent on the windowsill, and then he looked at her. "My name isn't important," he said. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore. This is my apartment." "Yes." He waited. She sat down. She hated herself a little for it, but she sat. He remained standing, reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a manila envelope, which he set on the coffee table beside her cooling soup. He didn't open it. "Your father's name was Robert Whitmore," he said. "He died 6 years ago. Cardiac arrest," the death certificate said. "You were 22. You were in your last semester at UIC. You dropped out afterward and never went back." Scarlett's hands were flat on her thighs. She pressed them down hard enough to feel her own pulse. "You have one surviving family member you're close to," the man continued. "Your mother's sister, Evelyn Cross. She lives in Evanston, retired school teacher. She has a garden. She walks her dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, every morning at 7 a.m. along the lakefront path." The cold in Scarlett's chest had spread to her arms. "What do you want?" she said. It came out flat, not a question. The man nodded at the envelope. "Open it." She didn't want to. She opened it anyway. Inside were papers, dense legal documents she couldn't immediately parse, and beneath them, photographs. Her father's signature on documents she didn't recognize. Numbers. A name repeated across multiple pages in bold type. "Moretti. Your father borrowed money from an organization," the man said. "A significant amount of money over several years. He made certain promises in exchange. He died before those promises could be fulfilled or the debt repaid. Under the terms of the original agreement, outstanding obligations transfer to surviving family." Scarlett looked up from the papers. "My father wasn't... He didn't have anything to do with..." She stopped. Her mouth was dry. "He was an accountant." "Yes," the man said. "He was." Something in the way he said it made her go very still. "The organization has decided to call in the debt," the man said. "Not in money. The principal has a different proposal." "What proposal?" "Marriage." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Scarlett stared at him. "Damien Moretti," the man said, "is 34 years old. He is currently unmarried. He has decided that you are the appropriate candidate for his wife." "That's..." Scarlett heard her own voice come out strange and thin. "That's insane. That's not... People don't... This isn't..." "You have 48 hours to decide," the man said. "If you agree the debt is cleared, you will be provided for. Your aunt will be safe. If you decline..." He paused, and the pause itself was precise, calculated, the most dangerous part of everything he'd said. "Evelyn Cross walks her dog every morning. 7 a.m., the lakefront path." Scarlett's vision had gone a little white at the edges. "He's going to hurt her," she said. "If I say no..." The man picked up her soup bowl, looked at it briefly, set it back down. "I said what I said, Ms. Whitmore. I haven't made any additional statements." He walked to the door. 48 hours, he said. "There's a phone number on the last page of the envelope. When you've decided, call it." He paused with his hand on the doorframe. "Mr. Moretti is a busy man. Don't make him wait past the deadline." The door closed. Scarlett sat on her couch in her small apartment in Wicker Park, with the paper spread across her coffee table and the soup going cold and the dead succulent on the windowsill, and she did not move for a very long time. She was still sitting there when the first light of morning came through the window. She spent the 48 hours in a way that surprised her later when she thought about it. Not in tears, not in the paralyzed spiral she might have expected from herself. She spent them thinking. She pulled everything she could find about Damien Moretti. It wasn't much. He was not the kind of man who appeared in news articles unless a journalist was very brave or very stupid. There were photographs from charity events, a tall figure in dark suits, a face that gave away nothing, dark eyes that looked at cameras the way most people looked at minor inconveniences. He'd taken over the Moretti organization at 26 when his father, Vincent Moretti, had stepped back from the operational side, or appeared to. He owned a penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He owned legitimate businesses: real estate, private security consulting, 2 restaurants. He was known in certain circles as a man who kept his word and was very precise about the words he gave. He was also known in those same circles as a man you did not cross. She found one photograph that had been taken from a distance, candid rather than posed. Damien Moretti outside a building somewhere in Manhattan, mid-stride, face turned slightly away from the camera. He was bigger than she'd expected from the charity photos, the kind of broad through the shoulders that came from actual physical use rather than a gym. His expression in that unguarded moment was not angry, harder than that, contained, like a door with too many locks on it. She looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she thought about Aunt Evelyn. Evelyn Cross was 63 years old. She had crow's feet and warm hands and a laugh that started somewhere deep in her chest, and she made the best lemon cake Scarlett had ever tasted. She had been the one to drive 4 hours to Scarlett's college when Scarlett's father died and sit with her in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel for 2 hours while Scarlett figured out how to breathe again. She walked Biscuit every morning at 7 along the lakefront. She didn't lock her back door half the time because she said the neighborhood was safe. Scarlett called the number. The man with silver hair answered on the second ring. "Yes?" Scarlett said. A brief silence. We'll send a car tomorrow morning at 10. I want something in writing, Scarlett said, that my aunt, Ms. Whitmore. His voice was patient and almost kind. You have nothing to negotiate with. You've already agreed. The car will be there at 10. He hung up. Scarlett set her phone down on the kitchen counter and looked at her apartment. The books, the dead succulent, the bowls she'd never gotten around to washing from 2 nights ago, and thought, this is the last time I'll see this place as mine. Then she went and packed a bag. The car was a black Escalade with tinted windows and a driver who did not speak. They took 90 East out of Chicago, and she watched the city fall away behind her, and then there was nothing but highway and flat Midwestern sky going gray at the edges of the afternoon. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and her bag at her feet and tried to build some version of herself that could survive whatever the next hours were going to be. She'd been a librarian for 5 years. She was good at being quiet, at existing in spaces without disturbing them, at holding her expression steady when patrons were difficult, or the days were long and the fluorescent lights buzzed, and there was no particular reason to smile, but she smiled anyway because it was easier. She was good at getting through things. She told herself that was enough. It wasn't until the Manhattan skyline appeared through the windshield in the dying light of the afternoon that her hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose and watched the skyline grow larger and didn't let herself think about what she was walking into. The Escalade pulled up in front of a building on 74th Street, glass and steel. A doorman in a gray coat who opened her door without expression. A lobby that smelled like money in that specific hushed way that serious money has. She was escorted to an elevator by a man who was clearly security, big, watchful, professional, not unkind, and taken up to the penthouse floor. The elevator opened directly into the apartment. It was large. That was the first word she had for it. Large and dark and spare in a way that didn't feel like minimalism chosen for aesthetics, but like the space of someone who had not thought much about comfort. The windows ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls and gave onto the city below. Manhattan spread out in the early dark, lights coming on in 10,000 windows. There was a kitchen to the left, a sitting area straight ahead, hallways disappearing to either side. Everything was expensive and nothing was warm. A man was standing at the far window with his back to her. She had prepared herself for this moment. She had rehearsed some version of a neutral expression, a steady voice, the quiet competence she'd spent years cultivating. She'd told herself he was just a man, that she had handled difficult people before, that fear was only biology and she was in charge of her own responses. He turned around and all of that preparation went sideways. Damien Moretti was the photograph, and also nothing like the photograph, taller than she'd realized, which the images hadn't quite captured. He stood like someone who had never once in his life worried about taking up too much space. Dark suit, no tie, collar open. His face was not what she'd expected. She'd expected brutal. He was angular instead, high cheekbones, a jaw that looked like it had been designed for clenching, dark eyes that moved to her and then went perfectly, deliberately still. There was a scar along his left jaw, faint and old, barely visible. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't peace. It was control. Absolute, practiced, expensive control. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, directly, measuring, giving away nothing. Scarlett Whitmore, he said. His voice was low. Not the silver-haired man's patient bureaucratic tone. This was something rougher, more private, like a voice that wasn't used to speaking to people it considered worth explaining itself to. Mr. Moretti, she said, and was grateful her voice came out level. Something moved briefly in his expression. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. Like he'd expected something different. He walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly, just with that same economy of movement that seemed to be the mode he operated in, and stopped at what was probably a deliberately calculated distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to not be threatening. Sit down, he said. I've been sitting for 6 hours, she said. I'd rather stand. A pause. Something shifted in his eyes. Very briefly, there and gone. All right, he said. He turned and walked to the kitchen, and she heard the sound of something being poured. He came back with 2 glasses. Water, she realized. He set one on the coffee table near her without comment. Then he sat, which she hadn't expected, in an armchair near the window and looked at her. She remained standing. "You agreed to this arrangement," he said. "You didn't leave me a lot of alternatives." "No," he said. "I didn't." The honesty of it startled her. She'd expected justification, deflection, the language of people who do terrible things and need you to understand that they had reasons. He just said it. "What happens now?" she said. "The wedding will be in 2 weeks. City Hall. Small. There will be a legal document outlining the terms." He paused. "What belongs to you remains yours. You'll have your own rooms, full access to the building. There are house staff, a car service, accounts in your name. You will not be monitored. You will not be followed." She studied him. "And in exchange, you carry the name. You attend events when required. You conduct yourself with—" A pause, brief, like he was selecting the word carefully. "Discretion." "That's it. There is one additional item," he said. His voice didn't change. "I want to be clear about it so there is no misunderstanding later." She waited. "I will never touch you," Damien Moretti said, "unless you ask me to." The city glittered behind him in the window, 10,000 lights in the dark, and Scarlett Whitmore stood in the penthouse of a man she'd known for 6 minutes and tried to find the lie in his face. She couldn't find it. That was almost worse. "Why me?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Not warmth, not exactly, but something that wasn't the cold blankness she'd been steeling herself for either. "That's not a conversation for tonight," he said. "Then when?" "When you trust me enough to hear the answer." She almost laughed. It came out wrong, sharp, incredulous. "You forced me into a marriage and you want me to trust you." "I didn't say it was a reasonable expectation," Damien said. "I said it was a prerequisite." He stood. "I'll have someone show you to your rooms. Dinner will be sent up if you want it. If you don't, no one will bother you." He started to walk past her toward the hallway. "Mr. Moretti?" He stopped. "If you break any of what you just said to me," Scarlett said, "if you lie to me about any of it, I will find a way to make that a problem for you. I don't know how yet, but I will." He turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. In the low light of the apartment, with the city laid out behind him and the scar faint along his jaw, his expression was impossible to read. "I know," he said, and then he walked away. The rooms were too much. That was the only way to put it. A bedroom larger than her entire apartment in Wicker Park, with windows that looked east toward the river. A bathroom with heated floors and a soaking tub she could have slept in. A sitting room with bookshelves that someone had stocked with actual books. Not decorative spines, real books, dog-eared and varied and strange in their range. She stood in front of the shelves for a while. Somebody had put a copy of Middlemarch between a history of the Ottoman Empire and a thick book on structural engineering. She pulled the Eliot out and looked at it. The margins had pencil marks in them, brief, cramped handwriting she couldn't make out in the low light. She set it back and sat on the edge of the enormous bed and looked at her hands. She had agreed to marry a man who controlled what amounted to a criminal empire stretching across the East Coast. She had done it to protect a 63-year-old woman who walked her dog every morning and didn't lock her back door. She was sleeping tonight in a penthouse in Manhattan in rooms that had been prepared for her by staff who knew she was coming before she'd called to agree. That last part lived in her like a splinter. Before she'd called. The rooms had been prepared before she'd called. She lay back on the bed without taking her shoes off and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what that meant. Either Damien Moretti was so confident in his own leverage that he'd assumed her answer before she gave it, which was arrogance, but a specific and rational arrogance given the circumstances, or there was something else, something she wasn't seeing yet. She thought about his voice. I didn't say it was a reasonable expectation, the way he'd said it without defensiveness, without trying to make it palatable, like he was used to stating facts about himself that weren't flattering and had made his peace with it. She thought about his hands. She'd noticed them when he'd set the water glass down. Big hands, a small scar across the knuckle of his right index finger, the careful precision with which he'd placed the glass rather than just dropping it. A man who paid attention to how he handled things. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she did, she didn't dream. Miss. The first week inside the Moretti penthouse was a study in controlled strangeness. Damien left early. She heard movement in the apartment before 6 a.m., and the place was quiet by the time she emerged at 8, and returned late. Sometimes she was already in her rooms when he came back. Sometimes she was in the kitchen making tea because she couldn't sleep, and she'd come out to find him standing at the kitchen island with his jacket off and a glass of something dark on the counter, and a look on his face that cleared the moment he registered she was there. They were excruciatingly polite to each other, which was its own kind of violence. The house staff were efficient and unobtrusive. There was a woman named Rosa who managed the household and who looked at Scarlett with an expression that was careful and watchful and not unkind, like she was weighing something. There was a man named Chen who drove the car and who answered questions in precise monosyllables. There was a young man who came in 3 days a week to handle what seemed to be an enormous amount of administrative paperwork, and who looked at Damien with the focused anxiety of someone trying to be useful and not sure they were managing it. Scarlett spent the days reading. She walked to the building's private gym in the mornings and ran on the treadmill until she'd emptied her head out, and then she came back and showered and made coffee and read until the afternoon. She explored the apartment in pieces, the library off the main hallway, which was enormous and organized in a system she couldn't immediately crack. The formal dining room that looked like it had been used perhaps twice, a room at the far end of the east hallway that was locked. She didn't try to open the locked room. She noted its existence and moved on. On the 5th day, she found a piano in a room near the library. It was a black upright, older, well-maintained. She hadn't played seriously since college, but her hands remembered. She sat down and played for an hour, badly at first, and then less badly, running through pieces she'd learned as a teenager, and then improvising in the gaps when her memory failed. The apartment was empty. She played louder than she'd intended. She didn't hear him come in. She became aware of him the way you become aware of a change in air pressure, a kind of atmospheric shift in the room. And she stopped playing and turned, and Damien was standing in the doorway with his jacket over his arm and a look on his face that she hadn't seen before. He wasn't guarded in that moment. He'd caught himself without the armor on. "I didn't know you played," he said. "I didn't know there was a piano," she said. He looked at it briefly like he was calculating something. "My mother played," he said. Then the door closed back over his face, and he was the controlled, measured man again. "I apologize for interrupting." "You didn't interrupt. I was just—" She stopped. "You don't have to apologize for being in your own apartment." He looked at her. "No," he said. "I suppose I don't." He left. She sat at the piano for a long time afterward and thought about his face in that unguarded second, something in it that looked like grief that had been carried so long it had calcified into something harder. The wedding happened on a Wednesday. City Hall, just as he'd said. A judge. 2 witnesses she'd never met. Damien in a dark suit, Scarlett in a navy dress she'd bought herself because she'd refused to let Rosa arrange something for her. This was the one boundary she'd drawn, small and largely symbolic, but hers. It took 11 minutes. She signed her name on the certificate. Damien signed his. The judge congratulated them in the tone of someone who had said those words 10,000 times. One of the witnesses, a man built like a defensive lineman who turned out to be Damien's head of security, a man named Marcus, shook Damien's hand with the careful formality of professional loyalty. The other witness, a sharp-faced woman named Diana, who Scarlett gathered was some kind of attorney, looked at Scarlett with an assessment that lasted approximately 3 seconds and then was concluded. Outside on the steps, in the thin October sunlight, Damien turned to her. "There's a dinner tonight," he said. "Business. I would ask that you attend, but I want to make clear it's a request, not a requirement." She looked at him. "Who will be there?" "Associates," he said, which told her precisely nothing and exactly everything. "What do I need to know going in?" Something shifted in his expression. He hadn't expected that question, or hadn't expected it phrased that way. "You need to know that no one in that room will speak to you disrespectfully," he said. "If they do, I'll handle it. I'd rather handle it myself." A pause. The faintest thing moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of something that was going to become an expression, interrupted before it could complete itself. All right, he said. The dinner was at a restaurant in Tribeca that Moretti owned, one of the two she'd gathered. And there were 8 people at the table. She didn't get all the names. She got the weight of it, the way the room arranged itself around Damien when he entered, the particular quality of attention that powerful men pay to someone more powerful, the way conversations paused and recalibrated. She got the way those same men looked at her, assessing, curious, some of them dismissive, 2 of them with something more complicated that she filed away for later. She sat beside Damien and ate her food and said what she needed to say when she was spoken to, and didn't say anything when she wasn't. She watched how he moved through the dinner, the economy of his attention, the way he gave each person precisely as much as was required, and nothing extra, the way he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, everyone in his radius went still. A man across the table, thick neck, a ring on his right hand that cost more than her car had, a quality of aggressive joviality that she pegged immediately as the social manner of someone who needed to be the loudest person in the room, made a comment halfway through the second course. He was talking about some recent piece of business, and he turned to Scarlett with the expansive gestures of a man performing inclusion and said, "Of course, this probably goes right over your head, sweetheart. Damien always did have a soft spot for pretty women who don't ask too many questions." The table went briefly quiet. Scarlett set her fork down. "His name is Damien," she said pleasantly. "You should use it, and I've been listening to this conversation for 40 minutes. You've mentioned the Harlow arrangement 3 times, which suggests you're either nervous about it or proud of it. I can't tell which, but either way, you're talking about it too much. That's the kind of thing that gets people in trouble." She picked her fork back up. "But you're right that I'm not asking questions. I generally find it more useful to pay attention." The silence stretched another 3 seconds. Then Damien, without inflection, said the name of the man across the table, "Leo," and the conversation moved on. Under the table, Damien's hand found her wrist, not gripping, not restraining, just his fingers settling lightly over her pulse point for a single moment, and then withdrawing. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. But she felt something change in the air between them, quiet and irreversible, like a door that had been opened a crack and now could not entirely close again. Well, they got back to the penthouse at 11. Rosa had left a light on in the kitchen and turned everything else down low. Damien loosened his tie in the elevator without seeming aware he was doing it. In the apartment foyer, he stopped. "That was well done," he said. "Tonight." "I didn't do anything." "You did exactly what needed to be done, without being told, without asking how." He looked at her with that direct measuring quality that she was starting to understand was just how he saw things. Not coldness, not cruelty, but an absolute refusal to look at anything other than what was actually there. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered this with a seriousness that suggested he wasn't going to give her a flattering answer. "Someone more frightened," he said, "or more compliant. One or the other." "I'm frightened," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "You do it very quietly." She didn't know what to do with that. She looked away first, which annoyed her. She filed it away, the small defeat of it, and turned toward the hallway to her rooms. "Scarlett," she stopped. "The man my people sent to your apartment," Damien said. "He told you about your aunt." She turned back slowly. "Yes." "She's safe," he said. "She'll always be safe. I want you to know that isn't conditional." She studied him in the low light of the apartment. "Why would you tell me that now? That removes your leverage." "Yes," he said. "That's not how this kind of arrangement is supposed to work." "No," he said. "It isn't." He walked to his own rooms without saying anything else, and Scarlett stood in the hallway of the Moretti penthouse in Manhattan and listened to the city 60 floors below and thought about a man who had forced her into a marriage and then immediately began dismantling the tools he'd used to do it. The thing that lived like a splinter, the prepared rooms, the arrangement in place before she'd agreed, pressed harder. She went to her rooms and lay on her bed and did not sleep for a long time. Boss. 3 weeks into the marriage, she found the file. Not the file. Not yet. That came later, and when it did, it would break something she hadn't known she was building. But this file, a thin folder left on the kitchen counter that Rosa had clearly meant to put somewhere else and hadn't gotten to, fell open when Scarlett picked it up, and the name on the first page stopped her cold. Robert Whitmore. Her father's name. In a file in Damien Moretti's kitchen, dated from 6 years ago. She stood there with the folder in her hands and the morning light coming through the windows and the city silent 60 stories below, and she understood, in the way you understand things you aren't ready for, that the story she'd been told about her father and his debts was only a part of whatever the truth was. Maybe not even the true part. She was still standing there when she heard the elevator. She had exactly enough time to set the folder back on the counter and take 3 steps toward the coffee maker before the doors opened and Damien walked in, still in his coat, and found her in the kitchen. He looked at her. She looked at him. And she watched. She was certain she watched. The precise moment he registered the folder on the counter, registered where she was standing, registered the geometry of the last 30 seconds. His expression didn't change. Not a flicker. "Coffee?" she said. "Please," he said. She turned to the machine. Her hands were perfectly steady. She made the coffee and handed him the cup, and he drank it standing at the counter, and they talked about nothing. Rosa had mentioned that the elevator in the service entrance was making a sound again, something about a dinner they'd been invited to next week. And he finished the coffee and set the cup in the sink and left. The folder was gone. She hadn't seen him take it. She stood in the kitchen alone with the coffee maker dripping its last drops into the carafe and thought, whatever is in that file, he already knows that I almost saw it. And he didn't say a word. He was protecting something, or hiding something, or both. The question that had been a splinter since the first night, the prepared rooms, the certainty before she'd agreed, pressed itself so deep it became impossible to ignore. Her father, 6 years ago. A file with her father's name in it, in the apartment of the man who had forced her into a marriage to cancel a debt she was increasingly not sure had ever existed. She stood in the kitchen of the most powerful criminal in the eastern United States, and she thought, I need to find out what happened to my father. And beneath that, quieter, more dangerous. I need to find out who Damien Moretti actually is before I make the mistake of trusting him. It was already, she realized with a cold clarity that settled into her chest like winter, almost too late for that. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, in the late-night kitchens and the dinner table and the piano room and the moment his fingers had found her wrist, she had already begun. She spent 2 days sitting on what she knew. That was the thing about working in a library for 5 years. You learned patience. You learned how to hold a question without immediately tearing it open. You learned that the way you approached information mattered as much as the information itself, that coming at something wrong could close doors that would never open again. So she waited. She watched. She paid attention to the texture of the apartment, the rhythms of the people in it, the particular silences that Damien moved through versus the ones he created. He created a lot of silences. What she noticed in those 2 days was that there were 2 Damien Morettis operating in the same body. There was the one she saw at the dinner table and in passing in the hallways, contained, precise, moving through the world like a man who had calculated every possible variable and accounted for all of them. And then there was the one she caught in fragments, standing at the window at midnight with a glass he wasn't drinking from, or pausing in the kitchen doorway for just a second too long when he found her already there. And this was the one she kept returning to. The 2 seconds in the piano room when his face had been completely unguarded, and what she'd seen there had looked like loneliness so old it had become structural. On the 3rd day, she went to find Marcus. Marcus Webb was Damien's head of security and had been for, she'd gathered, about 8 years. He was 6'4" and built accordingly, and had a quality of watchful stillness that reminded her of Damien's but was different in its texture, where Damien's control felt internal, contained, Marcus's felt outward-facing, like a man whose job was to see things before they became problems. He was sitting in the small office off the main hallway when she knocked on the open door, working through something on a laptop, and he looked up with an expression that was professionally neutral. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. She still flinched internally at the name. She kept it off her face. "I have a question," she said. "All right. My father's name was Robert Whitmore. He died 6 years ago. I want to know how he was connected to the Moretti organization." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A recalibration, brief and precise. "That's not something I can answer," he said. Can't or won't. Mrs. Moretti? Scarlett, she said. Please. And I'm asking you directly, as someone who's trying to understand the situation she's in. You work for Damien. I understand that. I'm not asking you to go against him. I'm asking you what you're able to tell me. Marcus looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked back at his laptop screen. Your father was a careful man, he said to the screen. He kept records of things. That's all I'm able to say. She let the silence sit. The file on the kitchen counter, she said. Was that an accident? Marcus's jaw shifted, just slightly. I wouldn't know anything about that. Of course not, she said. Thank you, Marcus. She left him to his laptop and walked back through the apartment and stood at the window in her sitting room and watched the city below and thought, someone left that file where I'd find it. Either it was Rosa making a mistake or it was someone who wanted her to see her father's name. And the only person with a reason to want that was the person who already knew she'd almost seen it and had said absolutely nothing. The question was why? She didn't get the chance to sit with that question for long. 4 days after the folder incident, Damien told her about the gathering. He found her in the library. She'd finally cracked the organizational system, which turned out to be by language first, then chronologically within each language, which was either deeply logical or mildly unhinged, and stood in the doorway in the way he had, which was to say completely still and waiting to be acknowledged rather than simply announcing himself. She looked up from the book in her lap. There's an event this weekend, he said. A gathering of, a pause, extended family, associates, a formal dinner at my father's estate in Greenwich. Everything in her went still. Your father? Vincent Moretti, Damien said, as if she might need the clarification. His voice had changed on the name. Not much, a fraction of degree, a cooling. He hosts this twice a year. Attendance is not optional. For you or for me? For either of us. She studied him. What do I need to know? He came into the library and sat, which surprised her. He usually delivered information from doorways, like he wanted to preserve the option of leaving quickly. He sat in the chair across from her and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her with that direct, undeflecting gaze. My father, he said, is not like the men at the Tribeca dinner. Those men respect me. They adjust their behavior accordingly. He paused. My father respects no one. He never has. He built this organization on the understanding that fear is more reliable than loyalty, and he has never updated that belief. Is he dangerous to me? He will attempt to establish dominance, Damien said. He'll do it subtly at first. A comment, a dismissal. He'll want to see how you respond, and he'll want to see how I respond to how you respond. He's testing you through me. Yes. And if I fail his test, you won't, Damien said. It came out flat, factual, like a statement about weather. She looked at him. You don't know that. I know you, he said. Then he seemed to register what he'd said, and something behind his eyes adjusted. I know enough about how you handle yourself to know you won't give him what he's looking for. She let that sit, both the correction and the thing before it, the unguarded version. What is he looking for? Fear, Damien said simply. Or weakness. Anything he can use. She nodded slowly. All right. What else? He told her about the estate, the layout, the guest list in broad strokes, the protocols that the organization operated by in formal settings. He was thorough and precise, and she listened carefully and asked practical questions, and he answered them without condescension, which she noted because it was not what she'd have expected a month ago. An hour into it, she realized they were having an actual conversation, not the careful politeness of the first weeks, not the transactional exchanges she'd gotten used to, but something that had the texture of two people actually thinking together. She wasn't sure what to do with that either. The drive to Greenwich took just over an hour. They sat in the back of the Escalade in the dark, and Scarlett watched the lights of the highway, and Damien worked through something on his phone and then put it away and looked out his own window, and the silence between them was different than it had been, less barricaded. How long has Marcus worked for you? She asked. 8 years. He's loyal to you specifically, not to the organization. Damien looked at her. Yes. How do you know that? The way he watches rooms, she said. He's not watching for threats to the organization. He's watching for threats to you. That's a different eye. A pause. Something moved in Damien's expression. You've spent your life watching people, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Librarians do, she said. People forget we're there. He turned back to the window. My father has 3 men like that, he said. Men loyal to him specifically, not to the family. They're older. Been with him since before I was born. They'll be at the estate. Are they a threat to you? Not actively, he said. They're a signal. When my father brings those 3 men to something, it means he's planning to say something he wants remembered. He's planning something this weekend. He's always planning something, Damien said. The question is what? The estate appeared through the windshield as they turned off the highway. Long driveway lined with bare trees, a house that was large in the way of old money, not showy but permanent, the kind of structure built to communicate that it had been here before you arrived and would be here after you left. Lights in every window, other cars already in the gravel drive. Scarlett took a breath. Damien, without looking at her, said, "You're fine." "I know," she said. Vincent Moretti was 71 years old and moved like a man who had decided at some point that age was a concept that applied to other people. He was shorter than Damien, significantly, which Scarlett noted because she suspected it mattered in some old calcified way. With a full head of white hair, gray eyes that were lighter than his son's and sharper in their quality, and the handshake of someone who wanted you to understand that touching him was a privilege he was extending. He took Scarlett's hand and looked at her with those light eyes and smiled. "So," he said, "this is the woman who managed to get my son to the altar." "He managed himself," Scarlett said pleasantly. "I just showed up." A half-second beat, then Vincent Moretti laughed. Real laughter, short and genuine, surprised out of him. Beside her, she felt Damien go very still. The dinner was enormous. 16 people at a long table in a dining room that smelled of old wood and expensive candles, with staff moving around the edges and conversations running in 3 different registers simultaneously. Scarlett sat 3 seats from Vincent on the left side of the table and watched everything. Vincent Moretti held court the way a man holds court when he's been doing it for 40 years and has stopped needing to work at it. He was charming. He was funny, even dry, precise humor with an edge to it. He drew people out and listened to them with what looked like genuine interest. He was, in the pure social sense of the word, formidable. And once every 15 minutes or so, he looked at Damien. Not conspicuously, not with hostility, just a glance, brief and assessing, the look of a man taking inventory of something he considered his. Damien did not look back. She understood something in those glances. The whole architecture of them, father and son, the empire between them. Whatever had happened in that childhood, Damien had mentioned only in its shadow and never directly. She understood that the dinner table was a performance that both of them were required to give, and that both of them hated it, and that they hated it in entirely different ways. She was halfway through the main course when the man to her right, a broad, well-dressed man named Arthur, late 50s, who she'd placed as some kind of financial operation, leaned toward her slightly and said, in the confiding tone of someone who thought he was being subtle, "How are you finding married life, Mrs. Moretti? Must be quite an adjustment." "It's been interesting," she said. "Damien's always been a singular sort of man," Arthur said. "Particular about things. I imagine that makes him a smile, the kind that had a second meaning inside it, a demanding partner." "I manage," she said. Arthur chuckled. "I'm sure you do. He picked well. You're much better than the last one. God, that woman was a disaster. Too much emotion. Damien needs someone with a steadier constitution." He lifted his wine glass. "More decorative, too, if you don't mind me saying." She minded. She smiled. "I do, actually, but thank you for the inventory." Arthur blinked. From the head of the table, Vincent said, without raising his voice, "Arthur, tell me about the Langley situation." And Arthur, with the trained responsiveness of a man who'd been redirected by Vincent Moretti before, turned away immediately. Scarlett looked down the table. Vincent was watching her with those light eyes and the faint suggestion of a smile. She held his gaze for 2 seconds and then turned back to her food. After dinner, the men moved to what Vincent called the study, which was apparently tradition, apparently non-negotiable, and Scarlett found herself in a sitting room with four other women who were, in various configurations, wives or companions of men at the table. The conversation was careful and surface level, the conversation of women who knew that what they said in rooms like this could be reported back. Scarlett participated minimally and listened maximally. What she gathered, there was tension in the organization. Something about territory on the southern end, Baltimore possibly. Two of the men at the table had interests that were in conflict. Vincent was in the process of arbitrating it in a way that would leave him, as always, holding the balance. And Damien, based on the careful way two of the women carefully did not mention his name, was not universally beloved by the older generation of the family. She was sitting with this information when the door opened and Damien appeared in the frame. He looked at her directly. "I need a minute," he said. She excused herself with a smile and followed him into the hallway, and he walked her to the far end of it, away from the study door, and stopped and looked at her, and she saw immediately that something had happened. "What?" she said. "My father made an announcement in the study." His voice was even, too even, the kind of even that came from actively managing something underneath it. "He's stepping back from operations." "You said he already stepped back." "From the visible side. He's announcing that he's transferring full operational control to me." A pause. "Effective immediately." She waited. "He's also announcing," Damien said, "that any debts or arrangements currently held by the organization are now under my authority to honor or dissolve." He looked at her steadily. "Including the arrangement that brought you here." She understood what he was saying. He now had the authority to dissolve her obligation, to release her, to send her back to Chicago and her small apartment and her dead succulent. "So I can leave," she said. "Yes." "Is that what you want?" Something moved behind his eyes. That complicated thing, the one she'd been catching in fragments and couldn't name. "What I want is not the relevant question." "It is to me." He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the distant sound of conversation from the study, the low register of men talking in the language of business. "No," he said, "it's not what I want." She studied his face. He held still under it, which she'd come to understand was a thing he did. Let himself be looked at directly, without deflecting, because deflection would tell her something, and he'd decided not to tell her that. "What happened to my father?" she said. The stillness changed quality, became something heavier. "Not tonight," he said. "Damien, not tonight," he said again, and his voice had dropped, and the way he said it wasn't a refusal. It was something closer to a warning, like, "If I tell you tonight, in this hallway, after this dinner, it will break something before it has enough structural integrity to survive breaking." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Not tonight." Something in his shoulders, barely perceptible, released. They went back into the gathering and finished the evening, and the drive home was quiet, in a way that felt less like distance and more like the particular silence of two people sitting next to something large and not yet looking directly at it. 3 days later, she came home from a walk. She'd started walking in the late afternoons, needing the cold air and the movement and the feeling of being in the city rather than hovering above it, and found the penthouse different. She felt it before she saw it, the quality of air, the particular silence that was not just emptiness, but something occupying the emptiness. Marcus was in the foyer. That was wrong. Marcus worked from the security office. He didn't stand in the foyer. He looked at her when she came in, and his expression was the one she'd learned to recognize as his version of alarm, controlled, minimal, but present. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. "What happened?" "Mr. Moretti asked me to have you stay in your rooms until—" "What happened, Marcus?" A beat. Marcus made a decision. "There was an incident at the restaurant on Chambers Street. One of the kitchen staff. We think it was targeted." He paused. "Mr. Moretti is handling it." "Is he hurt?" "No. He's—" Marcus stopped. From somewhere in the apartment, the hallway toward Damien's rooms, came a sound, not loud, a single impact, dense and controlled, like something struck against a wall. She moved toward the hallway. "Mrs. Moretti." She walked down the hallway and found the door to Damien's study open and Damien inside. He was standing with his back to her. His jacket was on the floor. The left arm of his shirt was pushed up, and there was a cut along his forearm. Not deep, already clotted, but red and raw. His right hand was flat against the wall, and his head was down, and he was breathing in a way that was controlled and deliberate, and she understood that he was working very hard at that, the control, that it was costing him something. "Damien," she said. He turned. His face was stripped. Not the contained man, not the measured man. Whatever had happened at the restaurant had gotten under the armor and was still there, moving behind his eyes. And for a second she saw it fully. The fury and the fear and something else underneath both of those. Something she recognized because she felt it sometimes in her own chest at 3 a.m. Dread. The specific dread of someone who has spent years managing a particular consequence and can feel it getting closer. "It was meant for me," he said. His voice was rough. The kitchen staff member, he wasn't... Someone paid him to get access to the restaurant. He stopped. "It was a message." "From who?" "My father's men," he said. "The 3 I told you about in the car." She stood in the doorway of his study and looked at him. The cut on his arm, the jacket on the floor, the way he was holding himself. And something that had been building in her for weeks came to the front. She crossed the room and went to the cabinet along the wall that she'd noticed had a first aid kit in it. Rosa had pointed it out once, months ago, practical and unremarked. And she opened it and took out what she needed and turned around. Damien was watching her. "Sit down," she said. "Scarlett, your arm," she said. "Sit down." A long moment. Then he sat in the chair behind his desk, and she pulled a smaller chair over and sat across from him and took his arm and began to clean the cut with the careful, methodical focus of something to do with her hands. He was very still. "The 3 men," she said while she worked. "They're acting against you." "They're acting for my father," Damien said. "That's different." "Is it?" A pause. "My father announced the transfer of authority," he said slowly. "But he's making sure I understand that transfer is conditional, that he can reverse it, that whatever I think I control, he controls the conditions of." She applied a bandage to the cut. His forearm was warm under her hands, the muscle there defined and still. "What does he want?" she said. "He wants me to run the organization the way he built it." His voice was flat. "Fear, control, the same machinery." A pause. "He's been watching me dismantle pieces of it for 3 years, quietly. Legitimate businesses, money moved out of the criminal operations, relationships with certain federal contacts who have been..." He stopped. She looked up from his arm. His eyes were on her face, dark and direct and carrying something that she realized, with a cold clarity, had been there since the beginning. Something he'd been moving toward telling her, in the careful, incremental way he did everything. "Federal contacts," she said slowly. He held her gaze. "My father," she said. The words came out strange in her mouth. 6 years ago. Scarlett. "He was involved in something federal," she said. "My father. That's what the file was. That's why his name is in your records from 6 years ago." She heard her own voice going very even, the way voices go when the body is trying to manage something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. "He wasn't a gambler. He didn't have debts." Damien said nothing. The silence confirmed everything. "The debt was fabricated," she said. "The entire reason I'm here, the arrangement, the men at my door, all of it." She stood up. The first aid supplies were still in her hands, and she set them on the desk carefully, because throwing them would be satisfying and wrong. "You built it. You constructed the whole thing." "Yes," he said. One word. No deflection, no justification. Just yes. She stood across the desk from him and looked at the man she had been, for weeks, in the slow and terrifying process of trusting, and felt something crack straight down the middle of her chest. "Why?" she said. He looked at her, and his face was open in a way she'd never seen it. All the armor down, every layer of control stripped back, and what was underneath was not the monster she'd expected the first night, and not the contained man she'd been living beside, and not even the wounded man she'd caught in fragments. It was just a man, carrying something very heavy for a very long time and running out of ways to carry it alone. "Your father wasn't just involved in a federal investigation," he said. He was the one who started it. He came to a contact 6 years ago with evidence, documentation of the organization's financial operations going back 15 years. He paused. My father found out. He issued a kill order. The room was very quiet. Your father died before the order was carried out, Damien said. Cardiac arrest, the death certificate said. But when my father's men found out there was a daughter, that Robert Whitmore had a daughter who he might have spoken to, who might have access to whatever he documented, he stopped. A second order was issued. Scarlett was very still. For me, she said. Yes. And you? She stopped. The geometry of it was assembling in front of her, piece by piece, and each piece was worse than the last. You fabricated the debt. You fabricated the whole arrangement, the forced marriage. Was the only legal structure that would allow me to bring you into my protection without my father's people being able to touch you, Damien said. My wife is untouchable under the organization's own codes. My father wrote those codes himself 20 years ago. He would not violate them without destroying his own authority. She stood in his study with the city spread out below the windows and her hands at her sides and thought about everything. The men at her door, the 48 hours, the prepared rooms that had been ready before she called, the file with her father's name, the way he'd told her the leverage was gone the first night, piece by piece, returning to her the things she hadn't known she'd given up. You saved my life, she said, by trapping me. Yes, he said. And then, I know what that is. I know what it cost you. I'm not asking you to... Stop, she said. He stopped. She stood in the quiet and breathed and felt the crack in her chest and underneath it, beneath the betrayal and the fury and the grief for the version of events she'd believed. Something else. Something she didn't want to look at directly, because looking at it directly meant she couldn't be as angry as she needed to be right now. I'm going to my rooms, she said. Scarlett, I'm going to my rooms, she said again, and her voice was level and terrifying in its levelness. And tomorrow I'm going to need to know everything about my father, about the investigation, about what happened to him. She looked at him across the desk, the cut on his arm, the jacket on the floor, the open face of a man who had just handed her the one thing he'd been protecting most carefully. All of it. Not pieces, not what you decide I can handle. Everything. He held her gaze. All right, he said. And Damien. She stopped at the door. If you lied to me about one single thing beyond what you've already admitted... She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't have an ending for it yet, and she refused to make a threat she hadn't completely thought through. She left him in his study with the first aid kit on his desk and the city below the windows, and walked to her rooms and closed the door. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. Her father had not been a gambler, had not left debts, had been a careful man who kept records, Marcus had said, careful words chosen precisely, had walked into something larger than himself and tried to do what he believed was right, and had died before anyone could protect him. And Damien Moretti, the man who was supposed to be the monster, had spent the 6 years since then dismantling pieces of the machine that had killed him and had built a cage around her to keep her alive, and had been, in his own impossible and infuriating and structurally unsound way, trying to tell her the truth since the first night. She put her face in her hands. Somewhere in the apartment she heard his study door close. She was not safe. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before. Not the abstract understanding of a woman who'd agreed to a coerced marriage, but the concrete, visceral understanding of a woman who had a kill order with her name on it, issued by a man she'd eaten dinner with in Greenwich, who had looked at her with light gray eyes and laughed at her joke, and who had, 3 days later, sent men to remind his own son who held the real power. She could not leave. Not because of the marriage now, not because of leverage, but because outside this apartment, Vincent Moretti's men were operating, and they knew her face, and the only thing standing between her and whatever they had been instructed to do was the man sitting alone in his study down the hall. The man she had just discovered had manipulated her entire life for the past several weeks. The man she had, quietly and against every rational instinct she possessed, begun to trust. She lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, there is no version of tomorrow that looks like the day before today. There is only forward. And forward meant she needed Damien Moretti, and he needed her, and whatever was going to happen next was going to happen to both of them, whether or not either of them had chosen it. Which was, she thought with a terrible and exhausted clarity, exactly how this had started. She didn't sleep. She lay on her back in the dark with her eyes open and her hands flat on her stomach and listened to the apartment breathe around her. The low hum of the city 60 floors below. The occasional sound of movement somewhere distant. The particular silence of a building that contained too many secrets to ever be fully quiet. At 4 in the morning, she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen island in the dark and waited for the light to come. Damien found her there at 6. He'd slept even less than she had. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the particular flatness around his eyes that wasn't his usual control, but its exhausted cousin. He was dressed already, dark shirt, no jacket. The bandage on his forearm was white against his skin. He looked at her across the kitchen island, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'll tell you everything." "Yes," she said, "you will." They sat at the dining room table, not the kitchen, not the casual geography of coffee and morning, but the actual table, which felt right for what this was. He brought a folder with him. He set it down and didn't open it immediately, just looked at it, and she understood that what was in it had weight for him too, that this wasn't only her grief. "Your father came to a federal contact in February 6 years ago," Damien said. "His name was Agent Daniel Reyes, Organized Crime Division. Your father had been doing the Moretti organization's books, not the visible books, the real ones, for 11 years. He was careful. He documented everything, transaction records, shell company structures, the flow of money through 16 different legitimate businesses that were being used to clean proceeds from," he stopped, "from operations your father spent 11 years pretending he didn't know the full nature of." Scarlett's coffee cup was in her hands. She held it, but didn't drink. "He came forward voluntarily," Damien said. Reyes confirmed that later. Nobody pressured him, nobody recruited him. He just decided. He walked into the Chicago field office in February and said he wanted to make a deal. "He never told me," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it. "He wouldn't have," Damien said. "Not because he didn't trust you, because he was protecting you. If you didn't know, you couldn't be used." She thought about her father, the accountant, the quiet man. The man who made her breakfast every Sunday morning without fail until she left for college, who called every week and asked about her professors and her friends and whether she was eating enough. The man she'd thought she knew. He was going to testify, she said. He was building the case. It was going to take time. The documentation he had was substantial, but it needed to be structured, corroborated. Reyes estimated 6 to 8 months before they'd be ready to move. Damien's hands were flat on the table. "My father found out in July, 5 months in." "How?" A pause. "Someone inside the federal office," Damien said. "Someone on Reyes's team who had been on the organization's payroll for 2 years. The coffee had gone cold in her hands. She set it down. "My father issued the order the same day he found out," Damien said. "I was 28. I was already running most of the operational side by then, but something like this—" He stopped. "Orders like that came from Vincent directly. They always had. I found out after my father died. 3 days after," Damien said. "One of my father's oldest men told me as a demonstration of how things worked, of what I had inherited." His jaw shifted. "Your father's cardiac arrest was real in the sense that his heart stopped. The substance they used induces that. It's undetectable in a standard autopsy. He died in his car in the parking garage of his office building at 8:47 in the evening on a Wednesday." Scarlett was very still. She knew, on some cellular level, that she had known this was coming, that the shape of everything she'd been learning had been pointing here, that the file with her father's name and Marcus's careful words and Damien's everything had been converging on this moment. She had known. Knowing hadn't made it smaller. "He was murdered," she said. "Yes." "By your father." "Yes." She sat with that. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her coffee cold in front of her and the city silent beyond the windows, and she sat with the fact that her father had died alone in a parking garage on a Wednesday evening, and she had spent 6 years believing it was his heart. "After I found out," Damien said, his voice careful now, threading through this like a man who understood he was in a field of things that could go off. I spent 2 years trying to locate and preserve everything your father had documented. Most of it had been seized by the organization's contact inside the federal office. But your father was careful. And there was Marcus's word again, careful, and she understood now what Marcus had meant. He'd made copies, multiple sets, hidden in different places. He paused. I found 2 of the 3 sets. My father's men found 1. And the federal investigation stalled without the documentation. Reyes retired 2 years later. The case is technically still open. A pause. With what I've been building over the last 3 years, the documentation I have, the legitimate business structures, it could be reopened. That's part of what I've been working toward. She looked at him across the table. You've been building a case against your own father. Yes. For how long? 3 years actively, in intention. He stopped. Since I found out what happened to Robert Whitmore. The room was very quiet. The kill order on me, she said. When did you find out about that? 4 months after your father died. My father's men ran a sweep of everyone your father had been in contact with, standard procedure. When they found out he had a daughter, that she was young, living alone, working a public-facing job, his voice had changed. Something underneath the control was pressing at it. The calculus was simple for them. She might know something. She might have something. Eliminate the variable. You intercepted it. I delayed it, he said. I told my father's men I'd handle it personally. That bought me time. He looked at her directly. I had 2 options. I could move you without explanation, put you somewhere safe under a false cover, which would have worked temporarily but was unsustainable, and which you would have found your way out of, because you are... A pause, brief, something complicated moving through his expression. Not someone who stays where she's put. Or I could bring you in under a structure that my father's own codes would protect. The marriage. A Moretti wife is untouchable. My father wrote that into the organization's operating codes in 1987 after my mother... He stopped. Something closed over. After an incident involving my mother. He never revisited it. It's the one thing he's never been willing to compromise on, because to compromise it would be to admit what happened to her. He paused. I used it. Scarlett breathed. You used your mother's pain, she said, not accusingly, just carefully, accurately, to build a structure to protect me. Damien's jaw worked. Yes, he said. She thought about all of it. The men at her door, the 48 hours, the city hall wedding, the weeks of careful distance and gradual closeness, and the piano room and his hand on her wrist at the dinner table, and the file on the kitchen counter that she now understood had not been Rosa's accident, had been him beginning to show her, piece by piece, in the only way he knew how. And she felt the full weight of it settle into her body like something being absorbed. Open the folder, she said. He opened it. She spent 3 hours with the documents. He answered every question she asked. Some of the answers were things she could absorb immediately. Some of them sat in her like stones she'd have to keep feeling the weight of for a long time. Her father had been trying, in the only way available to him, to do the right thing. He'd spent 11 years inside something he hadn't fully understood when he entered it. And when he finally understood it completely, he'd made the only decision he could live with, and it had killed him. He was not innocent. He was not guilty. He was a man who had made a choice too late and paid for it and tried, in the dying months of the attempt, to make it mean something. She understood him now in a way she hadn't when he was alive. That felt like both a gift and a specific kind of loss. I need air, she said at noon. I'm going to walk. Scarlett, Marcus can follow at a distance, she said. I know he will regardless. I just need... She stopped. I need the outside for a little while. He let her go. She walked for 2 hours in the cold afternoon, through the park, and along the reservoir, and back down through the Upper East Side with Marcus somewhere behind her, and the city indifferent around her. She thought about her father. She thought about Damien. She thought about the particular brutality of a situation where the person who had wronged you most profoundly had done it, in some fundamental sense, to keep you alive. She wasn't ready to forgive him. She understood that was a separate process from understanding him, and she wasn't going to collapse the two. But she also understood, walking in the cold with her breath making small clouds ahead of her, that she was still alive, that she was here, that her father's record still existed in at least partial form, and that the man who had spent 3 years trying to dismantle the machine that killed him was, in his way, still trying to make it mean something. She turned back toward the building. Cook. She was 3 blocks away when her phone buzzed. Marcus. One word. Come back. Now. She started moving faster without deciding to. She covered the 3 blocks in less than 2 minutes and came through the lobby and into the elevator, and the doors opened onto the penthouse, and she knew immediately that something had changed. Marcus was in the foyer, and his face was fully alarmed now. No management over it. And behind him she could see 2 men she didn't recognize standing near the hallway, and from the direction of the main living area she could hear voices. One of them Damien's, low and controlled, the control costing something. And another voice she recognized. Vincent Moretti. He came here? She said to Marcus. 20 minutes ago, Marcus said, without notice. She walked past him. The living area. Damien standing near the window, jacket on, hands at his sides, and in the chair that Scarlett thought of as Damien's chair, the one he sat in when he came home late and hadn't finished decompressing, was Vincent Moretti in a dark overcoat, sitting with the ease of a man who considered every room his by right of prior claim. Vincent looked up when she came in. Scarlett, he said warmly, I was hoping you'd be back soon. Damien looked at her. His eyes said, stay back. She looked at him, and then looked at his father, and walked into the room and sat on the sofa, which put her equidistant between them. Mr. Moretti, she said. Vincent, please, he said. We're family. He looked between them both with the benevolent expression of a man enjoying something he'd orchestrated. I was just telling Damien about a development that I thought warranted a personal visit. What development? Damien said. His voice was a wall. The federal matter, Vincent said pleasantly. The one your friend, Agent Reyes, has been quietly attempting to resurrect for the last 18 months. He paused. Did you know he came out of retirement? No, he's been working with a new contact. Young woman, very tenacious. They've been reconstructing the case from secondary sources. It's impressive work, actually. He reached into his coat and produced a photograph. Set it on the coffee table. Scarlett looked at it. The photograph was grainy, surveillance quality. A woman she didn't know, middle-aged, talking to a man outside what looked like a coffee shop. That's Reyes, Vincent said, tapping the second figure. And that, he tapped the woman, is interesting. Because that woman met with my son approximately 6 weeks before you were married. The room temperature changed. Scarlett looked at Damien. Damien's face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the controlled blankness, not the measured calculation. Something that was working very hard not to be panic. She's a federal prosecutor, Damien said. His voice was still level. She approached me about the documentation you've been gathering for 3 years, Vincent said. Yes, I know about the documentation, Damien. He picked the photograph back up and put it in his coat with the unhurried movements of a man who has all the time there is. I've known for 14 months. Silence. You knew, Damien said. I've been watching you dismantle things I spent 40 years building, Vincent said, and there was something in his voice now, not anger, which would have been easier, something older and colder. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think the men who've been with me since before you were born would simply not tell me? Damien said nothing. The restaurant incident, Vincent said. That was a message. I wanted to see what you'd do with it, whether you'd come to me. He paused. You didn't come to me. What do you want? Damien said. I want what I've always wanted, Vincent said. The organization intact. The work continued. What I built, preserved. He looked at Scarlett as he said this, and the look was specific, pointed. The marriage was clever, I'll give you that. Using the old codes to box me out. A faint smile. But the codes say a wife is untouchable. They say nothing about a wife who becomes a liability. Scarlett held his gaze. I need the documentation you've been building, Vincent said to Damien. All of it. The copies of Whitmore's records. Everything you've handed to the federal prosecutor. Handed over in full, with written confirmation that the federal conversation is terminated. He paused. In exchange, I step back from the organizational leadership permanently and formally. You take full control. No conditions. And if I refuse, Damien said. Vincent stood. He smoothed the front of his coat with the careful attention of a man who cared about how he looked when he said difficult things. Then Reyes has an accident, he said. The federal prosecutor has an accident, and the documentation becomes a problem that solves itself one way or another. He paused at the edge of the living area. You have 24 hours. I'd like the materials by tomorrow evening. He walked to the elevator. His two men followed. The doors closed. The apartment was very quiet. Scarlett sat on the sofa and breathed. Damien stood at the window with his back to her and both hands pressed flat against the glass and his head down. And she could see from where she sat the effort it was costing him, the shoulders, the jaw, the deliberately controlled rise and fall of his breathing. He knows about the federal case, she said. Yes. He's known for 14 months. Yes. The dinner in Greenwich. The announcement about transferring operational control. A performance, Damien said. His voice was rough. He was showing me he could give me everything and take it back. That I'd been operating under the illusion of authority while he watched me use it to dismantle his life's work. He turned from the window. His face was the worst she'd seen it. Not open this time. Broken open. The difference mattered. He let me believe I was winning for long enough that I built something real, and now he's using what I built to... He stopped. He's going to destroy the federal case, Scarlett said. Reyes, the prosecutor, everyone connected to it. Yes. And he's using me as the mechanism, she said. If you don't hand over the documentation, I become the liability. He doesn't have to touch me directly. He just has to make the threat credible enough that you choose the documentation over... She stopped. Over whatever this is. Damien looked at her. Whatever this is, she repeated, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, and she couldn't quite get the steadiness back into it. That's what he's gambling on. That you... She stopped again. Yes, Damien said, low and direct and stripped of everything except what it actually was. She stood up. She needed to move, needed to have her body doing something because the alternative was sitting still while this broke over her and she wasn't ready for that. The documentation, she said. If you hand it over, my father destroys it and the federal case dies and every person who is trying to rebuild it becomes a target anyway, Damien said. Handing it over buys time. It doesn't buy safety. He's lying about stepping back. He's been lying about stepping back for 6 years. He moved away from the window. If I give him what he wants, he wins. And then he stopped. She watched him stop, watched him work through whatever he'd been about to say, and decide not to say it. And then what? She said. And then you're still a liability, he said. With or without the documentation. You're Robert Whitmore's daughter. That doesn't go away. The understanding of it moved through her cold and complete. He'll come for me regardless, she said. The 24 hours is a fiction. Whether you hand over the documents or not, I'm still the daughter of the man who started this whole federal case. I'm still the person most likely to pick it back up. Yes, Damien said. She looked at him across the apartment, across the space where the last hour had happened, and thought about her father in his parking garage, and about the careful records and the attempt to do the right thing, and about all the years she'd spent not knowing any of this. And she thought about the man standing across from her who had built a cage around her to save her life, and was now standing inside the same cage. You have the documentation, she said, the copies of my father's records, your own 3 years of material. Yes. And access to the federal prosecutor. Yes. If you move now, she said, not in 24 hours, is now, tonight. If you got the documentation to the federal contact tonight and they moved on it, how long before my father-in-law loses the ability to make those threats? Damien stared at her. How long? She said. If the federal prosecutor gets everything tonight and has the authority to move, he was calculating. She could see it, running through variables at speed. 24, maybe 36 hours before there are enough warrants and enough federal presence that my father's men would be operating against federal interference, rather than just, so the window is now, she said. Not 24 hours from now. Now. If we move now, Damien said carefully, my father will know within the hour. His men are watching this building. They'll move before the federal contacts can. Not if we're not here, Scarlett said. Damien looked at her. She looked back at him and felt something settle in her chest. Not calm exactly, not the absence of fear, but the specific quality of a person who has run out of options and found that oddly clarifying. You need to get the documentation out of this building and to your federal contact tonight, she said. And we need to not be here when your father finds out you've done it. She paused. Marcus. Who does Marcus answer to? Me, Damien said, completely. Then call him, she said. We have maybe 2 hours before your father expects an answer on the 24-hour timeline. We need to be gone before then. She moved toward the hallway to her rooms. I can be packed in 15 minutes. Scarlett, his voice stopped her. If we do this, if I burn this down tonight, there's no version of tomorrow where I walk back into this life. The organization, my father's people, the operations, good, she said. He looked at her. Isn't that what you've been working toward for 3 years? She said, burning it down. Something moved across his face. The broken open thing again, but different this time. Not the dread she'd seen earlier. Something that was fighting very hard not to be hope, because hope was the most dangerous thing a man like him could afford to feel. Go pack, she said. I'll be ready in 15 minutes. She walked to her rooms and she was 3 steps into the hallway when she heard it. A sound from the direction of the service entrance. Not loud, a careful sound. The specific sound of a door that was being opened by someone who knew exactly which part of the frame to press to keep it from. The sound came again. Scarlett stopped in the hallway and turned back toward the main living area, and in the same moment she heard Damien say something sharp and low, not to her, and then everything happened at once. The service door came open hard, and 2 men came through it fast. The kind of fast that was trained and purposeful, and Marcus was already moving from somewhere to Scarlett's left, and the sound of the collision between Marcus and the first man was dense and immediate and ugly. The second man went for Damien. Scarlett pressed herself flat against the hallway wall. Her heart was doing something catastrophic in her chest. Not the slow dread of the last hours, but something immediate and animal, every nerve in her body screaming the same word. The second man was big, dark jacket, and he moved on Damien with a certainty that said he'd done this before, that he wasn't improvising. Damien turned into it rather than away from it. She registered that, the deliberate choice of it, and took the first blow across the shoulder instead of the face, and the impact moved through him visibly, but didn't stop him. He got inside the man's reach and used his elbow, and the man's head snapped back. Marcus had the first man against the wall near the service entrance. The sounds coming from that direction were very bad, and she didn't look at them. A third man came through the service door. She hadn't accounted for 3. The third man wasn't moving toward Damien or Marcus. He was scanning the room, and when his eyes found her in the hallway, the scan stopped. Damien saw it too. What happened next was fast enough that she processed it in pieces rather than as a sequence. Damien, mid-grapple with the second man, turned his body in a way that put himself between the third man and the hallway. The second man used the distraction. His arm came around. There was a sound like something solid finding something solid, and Damien went into the edge of the kitchen counter and down onto one knee, and the hiss of breath that came out of him was involuntary and raw. "Damien," she said, "stay there." His voice was rough but fully present. He was already getting back up. The third man was moving. She did the only thing available. She moved first, not toward him, sideways, into the living area, putting furniture between them. He adjusted. She kept moving. She was buying seconds, and she knew it, and seconds were what she had. "Marcus?" Damien said. One word, not loud. Marcus released the first man, who was no longer a significant problem from the look of him, and pivoted toward the third man, and the 2 of them met in the middle of the living area with an impact that shook the coffee table and sent the cups from that morning's coffee sliding. Damien got to the second man before the second man got to her. The fight was short and extremely ugly. Damien was hurt. She could see it in the way he was favoring his left side, the ribs, something wrong there. But hurt didn't mean stopped, and it clearly didn't mean slower. Or if it did, she couldn't tell because the speed at which he ended it was something that bypassed her ability to track it cleanly. The second man went down and stayed down. Marcus had the third man. And then it was quiet. The apartment looked like something had moved through it. The coffee table was at an angle. One of the chairs was on its side. There was blood on the kitchen floor. Not a lot, but present. and Marcus was breathing hard through his nose with his hands on his knees, and the three men were in various states of not standing up. Damien was at the window. He'd put one hand on the glass, and the other was pressed against his left side, and his head was down, and he was managing his breathing with the focused effort of someone who had done this before and knew what the breathing was for. "How bad?" she said. "Ribs," he said. "Not broken, probably." "Your confidence is very reassuring." Something moved in his expression that was almost the beginning of something. He straightened up from the window and looked at her, and then looked at Marcus. "My father didn't wait for the 24 hours, he said. "No," Marcus said. "He sent 3 men to his son's apartment." Marcus looked at the men on the floor. "He sent 3 men to deliver a message," he said carefully. "If he'd wanted an outcome, he'd have sent more." Damien was quiet for a moment, then, "The documentation." "Already in the car," Marcus said. "I moved it an hour ago, when he showed up." He looked at Damien steadily. "I didn't like how the visit felt." Damien stared at him for a moment. Then he said, "Call Chen. We need to be out of this building in 10 minutes. "Already downstairs," Marcus said. Scarlett picked her bag up from where she'd dropped it against the hallway wall. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not much, just a fine tremor she couldn't fully control. She made fists, and the tremor reduced to something manageable, and she breathed through her nose the way Damien was breathing through his, and told her nervous system to stand down because standing down was what the next 10 minutes required. Damien looked at her across the destroyed living room. "Okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went. The Escalade moved through Manhattan at 11 at night, and Scarlett sat in the back with her bag between her feet and Damien beside her, his breathing still controlled and deliberate, and Marcus in the front passenger seat working his phone with a focused intensity. Chen drove without speaking. "Where are we going?" she said. "The documentation goes to a secure location. Federal contact gets it within the hour." Damien's voice was even. She could see the effort. "We go somewhere my father's people don't know about." "Does that place exist?" "Yes." A pause. "One place." She didn't ask where yet. The car moved through the grid of streets, and she watched the city out the dark window and thought about the 3 men in the apartment and the sound Damien had made when he hit the counter edge, and her own hands against the wall buying seconds. She hadn't been afraid in the moment. That surprised her. Not the absence of fear exactly, but its deferral, pushed back while the moment required something else, available to catch up to her later. It was catching up now, the delayed version moving through her in slow waves. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. "The federal prosecutor," she said, "when she gets the documentation, she'll move for emergency warrants," Damien said. "My father has judges who'll slow it down but not stop it. Not with the volume of material." He paused. 24 hours, maybe 36. "And your father moves in that window." "Yes." "Against us specifically." "Against the case," Damien said. "We are the case now. The documentation is a copy. There are redundancies, material that lives in places my father can't reach. But he'll try to collapse it at the source, which means us," she said. "Yes." The car turned north and then east, and eventually they were moving through a part of the city she didn't know well. Less polished, more real, the Manhattan that existed beneath the Manhattan she'd been living in for the past weeks. They stopped in front of a building that was unremarkable by design, the kind of building that was built to not attract attention. Marcus got out first and checked something, and then came back to the car and nodded. Inside, stairs, 3 flights, a door that required 2 keys and a code. An apartment that was small and spare and clean and clearly maintained without being lived in, with a window that looked onto a narrow side street and enough sightlines that someone who thought about sightlines had arranged things deliberately. A safe house. The real kind, not the penthouse with security kind. She set her bag down. Damien sat heavily on the edge of the plain couch and let his breath out in a careful, controlled way that didn't entirely manage to conceal what the ribs were doing. He had his hand pressed to his left side again. "Let me see," she said. Let me see," she said. He lifted his shirt. The bruising was already developing, a deep red that would be purple by morning, covering the lower left ribs in a pattern that told her exactly what the counter edge had done. She pressed lightly at 2 points and watched his jaw tighten and the small, involuntary sound he kept to a minimum. "Not broken," she said, "but close." "I know what close feels like," he said. She sat back. "How many times have you had broken ribs?" A pause. "3. The first time." 14, he said. She absorbed that. "Your father," she said. Not a question. Damien looked at her steadily. "Yes." She thought about Vincent Moretti in his dark overcoat in that armchair, with his benevolent expression and his careful performance of paternal authority. She thought about a 14-year-old boy and what that left behind. She thought about the codes his father had written. A Moretti wife is untouchable. And what incident involving his mother had made a man like Vincent Moretti write that into the fabric of his own organization and never revisit it. She didn't ask, not tonight. She filed it next to everything else that was going to need to be understood when there was time to understand things. "Sleep," she said. "I need to monitor the—" "Marcus has the phone," she said. "If something happens, he'll wake you. Sleep. You're not functional like this." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating the argument and finding it wasn't actually available to him. He lay back on the couch, slowly, one arm over his eyes, and she got a blanket from the closet shelf and put it over him, and went to the window and stood watch while he slept. At 2 in the morning, Marcus's phone buzzed. The federal prosecutor had received the documentation. Emergency warrant application was being filed. A federal judge in the Southern District had been woken up. Marcus showed her the message. She stood at the window and read it and felt the first thing that had felt like forward motion in hours. She let Damien sleep until 4. He was awake when dawn came, sitting at the small table with Marcus and a city map in his phone, moving through contingencies. She made coffee on the apartment's basic stove and listened to them work and added things when she had them and didn't add things when she didn't. At 7:15, Damien's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face went very still. He answered it. "Father," he said. She heard Vincent's voice from across the room. Not the words, just the quality of it. Measured, warm, even. The voice of a man who did not feel the urgency of the morning because the morning's urgency was something he felt in control of. Damien listened. His free hand was flat on the table, completely flat, completely still, with the kind of stillness that came from managing something that wanted to move. "No," Damien said. His voice was quiet and final, more from the phone. "No," Damien said again, and then, "I'm done having this conversation." He ended the call. Marcus looked at him. "He knows about the warrants," Damien said. "He's moving the financial assets. He has people with the access to do it if he gives the order in the next 2 hours. If he gets the money out before the warrants execute." "The case survives without the money," Marcus said. "The case survives, but the people who can testify don't." Damien stood. "He's going to Greenwich. He's going to the estate, and he's going to consolidate there with his 3 men and the organization's old guard, and he's going to sit and wait and see what the federal machinery produces." He paused. "And when it produces warrants that he can fight in court for the next 3 years, he'll fight them." "Unless someone is at the estate before he gets there," Scarlett said. Both men looked at her. "He's leaving now," she said. "He called you from his car, didn't he? He's calling you while he's driving because he wants you to know where he's going. He wants you to come to the estate." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "He wants a face-to-face resolution," she said, "in his space, on his terms, where he's built the architecture of control over decades." "Yes." "Then we should go," she said. "Scarlett, he's not going to stop," she said. "The warrants are going to slow him down for 3 years while he fights them and spends money on lawyers and people get hurt and people die, and my father's death never means anything, or someone goes to that estate and finishes this face-to-face." She looked at Damien. "You've been working toward this for 3 years. You have the documentation in federal hands. You have the legitimate business structures. You have everything you need except the last step. The last step is walking into my father's estate and telling him it's over," Damien said. His voice was flat. "Yes," she said. "He has 3 men there who have been loyal to him since before I was born." "Yes." "And Marcus," she said, looking at Marcus. Marcus said nothing for a moment, then, Chen's downstairs. Damien looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized now because she'd cataloged every version of his expression over the past weeks. The controlled version, and the unguarded version, and the broken open version, and the version she'd caught in the piano room doorway. This was a version she hadn't seen before. It was the version of a man who has spent 3 years preparing for a moment and is now standing at the door of it and finding that preparation and readiness are not the same thing. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "Your father broke your ribs when you were 14, she said quietly. "He murdered my father. He issued a kill order on me before I knew his name, and he's been running an organization built on the fear of the people inside it since before you were born." She paused. "You've spent 3 years trying to dismantle that quietly, carefully, in the way you do everything. This is the part that doesn't get to be quiet." His eyes were very dark and very direct. "You shouldn't come," he said. "To the estate. It's not safe." "Nowhere is safe," she said. "That's been true since the men knocked on my door in Wicker Park. The only difference now is that we know exactly where the source is." A long silence. "Stay with me," he said. "Stay close, and do what I tell you when I tell you. Non-negotiable." "Non-negotiable," she agreed. The drive to Greenwich took an hour and 15 minutes. Scarlett sat in the back with Damien, and the cold morning came through the tinted windows, and the highway unrolled ahead of them, and nobody talked. Marcus rode in front with Chen and worked his phone and the documentation with the federal prosecutor and made calls in a low voice that she didn't try to overhear. Damien sat beside her and looked at the road ahead. At some point, she wasn't sure exactly when, somewhere on the Merritt Parkway with the bare trees going past, his hand found hers. Not dramatic, not announced, just his hand settling over hers on the seat between them, warm and deliberate, and she turned her hand over and held on. Neither of them looked at the other. They held on. The estate in daylight looked different than it had for the dinner. Larger, more exposed, the long driveway naked without its evening atmosphere. 2 cars were already in the drive when the Escalade came through the gate. One of them she recognized from Greenwich. The other was a dark town car she didn't know. "His men are here," Marcus said from the front. "Yes," Damien said. They got out. The front door of the estate opened before they reached it, and one of Vincent's men, one of the 3, the oldest of them, a man named Frank, who Scarlett had seen at the dinner and who moved with the deliberate authority of someone who'd been exercising it for 40 years, stood in the frame. He looked at Damien. "He's expecting you," Frank said. "I know," Damien said. They went inside. Vincent Moretti was in the study at the back of the house. He was standing at his desk when they came in, not sitting, not waiting in a performed posture of power, actually standing, which told her he'd been moving, that the morning had required movement, that underneath the controlled exterior something was working. He looked at Damien, then he looked at Scarlett. "You brought her," he said, not accusatory, noting. "She chose to come," Damien said. "Did she?" Vincent looked at her for a moment with those light, sharp eyes. "Robert Whitmore's daughter," he said, "walking into the lion's den." "Your metaphor," she said, "not mine." Something moved briefly in Vincent's face. He turned back to Damien. "The warrants," he said. "I've spoken to 2 judges this morning. They'll grant stays." "For how long?" Damien said. "But 6 months? A year? You know what the documentation is, Father. You know what it covers. You can fight it for 3 years and it still ends the same way." "Then I'll fight it for 3 years. And after 3 years," Damien's voice was very steady. "After 3 years of fighting, what's left? The organization is bleeding. The legitimate businesses are under scrutiny. The people who've been with you for 40 years are making choices about where they want to be when this concludes." He paused. "It's over. The question is what over looks like." Vincent was quiet for a moment. Quiet. "You did this," he said. "Not with heat. With something that was somehow harder than heat. The specific flatness of a man acknowledging a fact he finds unacceptable. 3 years. Under my roof, with my name, using my organization's resources to build something that survives past you," Damien said. "Yes, "I built this for you," Vincent said. The words came out different than the ones before them. Lower. Something exposed in them that she didn't think was calculated, that she thought might actually be what it sounded like. "Everything I built, you built it for the idea of me," Damien said. His voice didn't change, but something underneath it did. "Not for who I actually am. You've never been interested in who I actually am." The study was very quiet. Frank stood near the door behind them. Somewhere in the house, she could hear the presence of the other two men. Not sounds exactly, just the atmospheric awareness of people in adjacent spaces. Marcus was 2 steps behind her and 1 step to the left, and she knew without looking that he'd been tracking the location of those men since they walked through the door. Vincent looked at his son for a long time. 40 years, he said. "I spent 40 years building something that survives past weakness, past sentiment, past love," Damien said. "That's the word you're looking for, past love." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Vincent's jaw tightened. "Love is a liability in this world," Vincent said. "No," Damien said. "It's the only thing in this world that actually holds. You spent 40 years proving the other thing, and this is where it ends." He paused. "In a study, with your son, who you never knew, and a woman whose father you had killed, and federal warrants being executed on every financial structure you've built." He looked at his father steadily. "This is what 40 years of fear gets you." Vincent's eyes moved to Scarlet. She held his gaze. "Your father," he said to her. "He made a choice." "Yes," she said. "He tried to do the right thing. You killed him for it." "It wasn't personal," Vincent said. And the terrible thing was that he meant it. She could hear it, the genuine removal of the personal from it, the way the machine of his logic had processed her father as a variable and resolved it and moved on. "It was personal to him," she said. It was personal to me." Something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse. She wasn't going to give him remorse. That felt like too much to hope for and the wrong thing to want anyway. But something. A flicker of, she didn't know what. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of a man who has been very efficient at not seeing certain things suddenly and briefly seeing them. Frank moved behind her. Damien turned fast, not toward Frank, but sideways, putting himself between Scarlet and the movement from the door, and the next 3 seconds were the specific 3 seconds that everything had been moving toward since the men knocked on her door in Wicker Park 2 months ago, because Frank's hand was coming up and Marcus was already in motion, and Damien, Frank's hand came up with something in it, and Marcus hit him from the left side like a wall falling. The sound was catastrophic in the small room. Frank went into the bookshelf behind him, and the bookshelf gave way and books came down in a cascade, and Frank came down with them and didn't get up. Marcus stood over him, breathing hard, his hand braced against what remained of the shelf, and looked at Vincent Moretti with an expression that was not anger and not threat, but simply the expression of a man who has made a decision and is living in it. The other 2 men came through the door. Damien was already moving. He took the first one with his shoulder, bad shoulder, wrong side. She heard the sound he made, and drove him back into the doorframe, and the man's head hit the wood with a crack that ended his participation in the next several minutes. The second man got past him. Scarlet picked up the heaviest thing within reach, which was a glass paperweight from the edge of Vincent's desk, and threw it. Her aim was not good. It hit the man's shoulder instead of anything more useful, but it made him flinch and turn, and that was enough. Marcus had gotten free of Frank and covered the distance, and the second man went down hard. Then it was over. The study was destroyed. Books everywhere, a chair on its side, the desk lamp in 2 pieces on the floor. 3 of Vincent's men down in various configurations. Damien was against the wall with his hand pressed to his shoulder and his jaw set and his breathing raw and visible. Marcus was upright and bleeding from a cut above his eye that he hadn't noticed yet or had noticed and filed for later. Vincent Moretti had not moved. He stood behind his desk in the wreckage of his study and looked at what the last 90 seconds had produced, and his expression was not what she expected, not fury, not the cold calculation she'd been bracing for, something she didn't have an immediate word for, something that lived between recognition and grief, and was neither of them cleanly. He looked old, she realized. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked his age. "It's done," Damien said. His voice was rough with the shoulder and the ribs and the morning and everything that had preceded the morning. It's done, Father. Vincent looked at him. The warrants will execute today, Damien said. The financial structures are already compromised. Marcus's people moved on 3 of the shell companies before we drove out here. The organization's operational capacity is going to be functionally gone within 72 hours. He paused. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to tell you what's already happened. You're here to watch, Vincent said. His voice was quiet. You want to see my face when I understand that you've won? No, Damien said. I want to see your face when I ask you to stop. A silence. Stop, Vincent said. The people in the organization who aren't part of the criminal operations, there are 140 of them in the legitimate businesses, real employees, people with families. They survive this if there's a clean transition. They don't survive it if you spend the next 3 years fighting every warrant and every charge while everything burns around them. Damien pushed off the wall. She could see what it cost him. Stop fighting. Cooperate with the federal process. Take whatever deal they offer. Let the legitimate side of the business survive as something real. Vincent looked at him for a long moment. And what do you get? The chance to make it into something that isn't what it was, Damien said. Another silence. Longer. Vincent's eyes moved to Scarlett. She stood near the desk with the absence of the paperweight in her hand and her heart doing something enormous in her chest and her face as still as she could keep it. Your father, Vincent said to her. Robert Whitmore. He was going to burn it all down too. He paused. He was more like you than like what I expected. Quiet. Determined. He sat across from me once, years before all of this. A dinner, a business dinner, nothing remarkable. He asked me how I slept. His voice had something in it she couldn't name. I told him fine. He said that was lucky. He paused. I've thought about that dinner many times. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood with it. He was trying to do the right thing, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That's all he was doing. He had access to information that described real harm done to real people, and he tried to do something about it. That's not complicated. That's not remarkable. It's just, she stopped. It's just a person trying to be a person. Vincent was quiet. I had a wife, he said. It came out different from everything else he'd said. Lower, stripped of the performance quality. Damien's mother, Eleanor. I built the organization's codes around protecting her because He stopped. She left anyway. She took Damien when he was 16, and she left, and 2 years later she died in a car accident in Ohio that I've spent 20 years not being certain about. He paused. I built a structure around protecting her, and the structure itself became the thing she needed protecting from. Damien had gone very still. I didn't know, Damien said. His voice was different. The sun in it, rather than the man. The specific sound of someone learning something about a parent that rearranges the geography of the past. About the accident. You never? No, Vincent said. I didn't. The study held them all for a moment. The wreckage, the morning light coming through the window, 3 men unconscious on the floor, a father and son, and a woman from Chicago standing in the middle of 40 years of consequence. Then Vincent sat down in his chair behind his desk, and the movement was the movement of a man who has been holding something upright through will alone and has decided to stop. He picked up his phone. He looked at it for a moment. I'll need the name of the federal contact, he said. The prosecutor. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more complicated. Something that was going to take a long time to fully process. He gave his father the name. The federal agents arrived at the Greenwich estate at 11:47 that morning. Scarlett watched from the window of the sitting room down the hall while Vincent Moretti walked out the front door of the house he'd owned for 30 years and spoke to the lead agent and then turned and went back inside. And the process, the formal, procedural, deeply uncinematic process of everything becoming official, began. Damien came to stand beside her at the window. His shoulder had been looked at by the time Marcus had located a medical bag in the estate's utility room. Dislocated, reduced back into place by Marcus with a focused grimness that had produced a sound she was going to hear in her sleep for a while. The ribs were taped. He was upright and functional and moving like a man who had decided that pain was a bureaucratic inconvenience he would deal with at a more convenient time. He's cooperating, she said. Yes. Is that what you expected? Damien was quiet for a moment, watching his father through the window. No, he said. I expected to have to fight him until there was nothing left to fight over. He paused. I didn't expect him to. He stopped. To be capable of stopping, she said. Yes. She thought about what Vincent had said about Eleanor, about the codes built around protecting someone who ended up needing protection from the structure itself. She thought about Damien at 14 with broken ribs, and she thought about the piano in the penthouse and who had played it, and she thought about a man who had spent 40 years confusing fear for love and had arrived at 71 in the wreckage of his own study at some version of understanding. It wasn't redemption. She wasn't going to call it that. Redemption was a word that required too many things she wasn't ready to grant. But it was something, a stop, a choice to stop, that was real and small and had to be enough. The organization, she said, the legitimate businesses. They survived, Damien said. The criminal operations are gone. That's the federal deal. That's non-negotiable. But the real estate holdings, the restaurant group, the security consulting firm, the construction company, those are clean. They've been clean for 2 years. I made sure of it. He paused. 140 people keep their jobs. She nodded slowly. And you, she said, what do you keep? He turned from the window and looked at her, and the look was direct and open and carrying the full weight of everything the last several weeks had produced between them. He didn't deflect it. He let it be what it was. That depends, he said, on what you decide. She looked back at him. I'm not going to pretend the beginning of this was something other than what it was, she said. Her voice was steady. You forced me into a situation. You manipulated the circumstances of my life. You made a decision about what was best for me without asking me, and you built a cage around it and called it protection. Yes, he said, all of that. And you did it because the alternative was me dying in a parking garage like my father, she said. And you've spent every day since trying to give me back what you took. She paused. The leverage, the truth, the choice. Yes. You're not a good man, she said. You know that. Something moved in his expression. Yes, he said. You're trying to be one, she said. I've watched you try for weeks. She looked at him steadily. That's different. That's not nothing. He was very still. I'm not ready to be fine, she said. About my father. About the beginning of this. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I've processed it because I haven't. There's a lot of it I'm going to be carrying for a long time. She paused. But I know what you are underneath what you've done. I've seen it. The piano room in the kitchen at midnight and your hand on my wrist at that dinner table and 3 months of watching you be, piece by piece, the most careful and the most honest person I have ever been in a room with. She felt her voice do something at the edges, a slight unevenness she couldn't entirely control. That's also real. That happened too. Scarlett, I'm not finished, she said. I need you to understand something. He stopped. If you ever again make a decision about my life without asking me, she said, regardless of the reason, regardless of what you think is best, that's the end of it. I don't care what the stakes are. I'm not a variable to be managed. I'm not something to be protected by being controlled. She held his gaze. I need you to understand that the way you understand everything, completely and as a fact and without reservation. I understand it, he said, and then lower. I've understood it for a while. I just didn't know how to... He stopped, started again. I'm not good at asking. I'm good at deciding. I know, she said. That's the thing you're going to have to work on. Yes, he said. She looked at him in the daylight of the sitting room, the taped ribs and the bad shoulder, and the face that had been through a night and a morning that would take months to fully account for. And beneath all of that, the man she'd been finding in pieces since October. The man who was not the monster and not the hero, but something harder and more real than either. She crossed the room and stood in front of him the way she had in the safe house that morning, and looked up at him and he looked back at her. And the distance between them was the same distance it had been since the first night in the penthouse, the careful, maintained distance of someone who had promised and meant it. You said you'd never touch me unless I asked, she said. He held her gaze. I'm asking, she said. He put his hand against her face, the right hand, the one with the old scar across the knuckle, careful and warm and holding her face the way he held the water glass that first night, with the specific deliberate attention of someone who pays attention to how he handles things. His thumb found the line of her cheekbone and stopped there. She put her hand over his and held on. Outside, through the window, the federal agents moved through the grounds of the Moretti estate in the cold November light. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the low voice of Vincent Moretti cooperating with the process of everything his life had built becoming accountable. Marcus and Chen were in the kitchen, and she could hear the low register of their voices and something that might, distantly, have been the sound of a coffee maker. They stood in the sitting room of the Greenwich estate and held on. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing about it was simple. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the internal accounting she did in the small hours of mornings when the city was quiet and the life she'd built inside the wreckage of the one that had been forced on her was asleep around her. The federal process took 14 months to work through. There were depositions. There were attorneys. There were mornings when Damien sat across a conference table from federal prosecutors for 6 hours and came home looking like a man who had been turned inside out. And she made dinner and they ate, and she let him talk about it or not talk about it depending on what the particular evening required, and she learned the difference. She testified. Her own deposition lasted 3 days. She sat in a federal building in Lower Manhattan with a glass of water at her elbow and answered questions about her father, about the files, about what she knew and when she'd known it, and she did it carefully and completely and without drama. The court reporter's keys were the only sound. She thought about her father on the drive home each day, and she let herself feel the grief of it in the car where no one had to manage it with her. And by the time she got home, she was something she could work with. Agent Reyes, retired, then unretired, then retired again, sat across from her in a coffee shop in Brooklyn 3 months into the process and told her that Robert Whitmore's documentation, combined with the 3 years of material Damien had built, was the most complete case against an organized crime financial operation that his former unit had seen in 20 years. He said it carefully, professionally, but she heard underneath it the thing he was actually saying. Your father's attempt, the thing that killed him, mattered. It became the foundation of something real. She sat with that for a long time. Vincent Moretti took a plea agreement 11 months after the Greenwich estate. The sentence was 12 years. His attorneys negotiated it down from 22 on the basis of his cooperation, his age, and the speed and completeness with which he'd handed over the financial documentation. He was 71, and he'd serve it in a federal facility in Connecticut that was, by the standards of such things, as comfortable as 12 years in a federal facility gets. Damien drove to the federal courthouse alone the day the plea was entered. Scarlett offered to come. He said he needed to do it alone, and she understood that and let him go. He came back in the evening and sat in the kitchen of the apartment. Not the penthouse. They'd moved to something smaller and more real in Brooklyn, a brownstone with a garden that she was killing slowly and enthusiastically. And she sat across from him, and they drank wine, and he told her about the day. He looked smaller, Damien said, in the courtroom. I don't know why I expected... He stopped. You expected the man you were afraid of, she said. Yes. And instead you got the man who is afraid, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped on his way out, he said, past where I was sitting in the gallery. His attorneys were moving him along. It was just a second. He looked at his wine glass. He said, take care of the legitimate side. That was it. That was what he stopped to say. She looked at him. That was him, Damien said. That's the most he... He stopped again. He looked like a man pulling something through a passage too small for it. He never said sorry. He won't. I don't think he's capable of it. I don't think he understands his own life well enough to know where to put the apology. He paused. But take care of the legitimate side. That was him saying... He stopped. I know, she said. Do you? He was saying that you were right, she said, about what it could be. He couldn't say it plainly. He probably doesn't know how, but that was it. Damien looked at her for a long moment. I don't forgive him, he said. It came out flat and honest, and she valued the flatness of it, the refusal to dress it up. No, she said, you don't have to. But I don't... He paused. I don't want to carry it the way he carried things. I've watched what carrying things like that does. I don't want to be the next version of it. You're not, she said. I could be, he said. That's what I want you to understand. I could be. The architecture is there. The instincts, the way I calculate, the way I... He stopped. I'm not good at the things that matter. I'm learning, but I'm not there yet. I know, she said. I'm watching you learn. That's different from being there. He looked at her across the table in the Brooklyn kitchen with the garden outside the window that she was definitely killing, and the city going on at its own pace beyond that. And she saw the man she'd first seen in the Manhattan penthouse, contained, controlled, every door locked. And she saw how many of those doors were open now, not all of them, not without effort, but open. Chosen, open. That was the difference. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said difficult truths, directly, without decoration, looking at her so she'd know he meant the exact words and not a softer version of them. She put her hand on the table between them. He covered it with his. I know, she said. I love you too. Even the parts that still need work. That's most of the parts, he said. Yes, she said. I'm aware. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning in February, 14 months after the men had knocked on her door in Wicker Park. She sat on the edge of the bathtub with the test in her hand and looked at it for a long time. Outside the bathroom window, the city was doing what cities do in February, gray and cold and indifferent and completely alive. And the brownstone was quiet around her, Damien already at the office, the garden outside frozen and waiting for spring. She thought about her father. She thought about the parking garage and the careful records and the quiet man who had made her breakfast every Sunday and had tried, late and imperfectly and at the cost of everything, to do the right thing. She thought about what it meant to hand something to a person who comes after you, not safety. Safety was not something you could guarantee. She understood that now with a clarity she hadn't had before any of this. Not certainty. Just the attempt. The consistent, imperfect, daily attempt to be a person rather than a machine, to choose the harder thing, to not let the architecture of what you'd inherited determine the shape of what you built. She called Damien. He answered on the second ring, which he always did. Hey, I need you to come home, she said. A pause. 2 seconds, and she could hear him calculating. Not alarm, not yet, reading her voice for the temperature of the news. Good or bad, he said. Neither, she said. Just come home. 20 minutes, he said. She set the test on the bathroom counter and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window that looked out onto the frozen garden and thought about spring. About the particular stubbornness of growing things, the way they worked toward the light through whatever was in the way. She'd planted bulbs in November, optimistically, not knowing what November was going to contain. She'd completely forgotten about them until this morning. They were going to come up in April. She was almost certain of it. Damien came home in 18 minutes, not 20, which told her what she needed to know about the state of his heartbeat on the drive. She met him in the kitchen and handed him the test without saying anything. He looked at it. He looked at her. She watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do in all the months of watching, not the calculated opening, not the managed vulnerability, but something completely involuntary, something that bypassed all the architecture entirely. His jaw moved and his eyes went bright in a way that he didn't try to contain and didn't manage and didn't control. And she thought, there it is. There's the man underneath everything. He put the test down on the counter carefully, with both hands, the way he put things down when they mattered. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her. Not careful, not managed. Held her the way a person holds something they have been, without knowing it, afraid of losing for a long time. She held on. Okay, he said into her hair. His voice was rough. Okay. I'm terrified, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. We're going to be bad at this sometimes, she said. Yes. You're going to default to controlling things when you're scared. Probably. I'm going to shut down when I'm overwhelmed. I know, he said. We're going to have to keep working at it, she said. The whole time. It doesn't stop. I know, he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. His face was open and scared and certain all at once, and she thought about the first night in the penthouse when she'd looked for the lie in his face and couldn't find it. She still couldn't find it. That was still the truest thing about him. It's a girl, she said. She didn't know that, couldn't know it yet, but she said it with a certainty that surprised her on its way out. He looked at her. Something in his face settled. She's going to know everything, Scarlett said. Her grandfather. What he tried to do? The whole thing. When she's old enough. Not a version of it. The actual thing. Yes, Damien said. She's going to know that people are complicated, Scarlett said. And that complicated doesn't mean broken, and that broken doesn't mean finished. Yes, he said. And she's going to know, Scarlett said, that her father once made a terrible decision for the right reasons and then spent a long time trying to be the kind of man who makes better ones. She looked at him. That's the story I want her to have. Damien looked at her for a long moment in the kitchen of their Brooklyn brownstone with the frozen garden outside and the city beyond it. And she saw all of it in his face. The whole long complicated thing, the parking garage and the Wicker Park apartment and the penthouse and the piano room and the Greenwich estate and the 14 months of federal process and everything it had cost both of them to get from a Tuesday night in October to this Tuesday morning in February. That's a good story, he said. It's the true one, she said. That's better. He held her face in both hands, the right hand with the scar across the knuckle, the careful, deliberate hold of a man who pays attention to how he handles things. And she covered his hands with hers, and they stood in the kitchen while the city moved around them at its own pace, indifferent and alive, carrying 10,000 other stories in 10,000 other windows. Outside, under the frozen garden, the bulbs she'd planted in November were doing what they do in the dark. Working toward something, not knowing yet what the spring looked like, just moving toward it anyway, the way things do when they're determined to survive. The story had begun with an ultimatum. It ended with two people standing in a kitchen at 9 in the morning, scared and certain and holding on. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.